good afternoon everybody, and welcome to this webinar on better understanding of sexual abuse to create effective policy and practice. Thank you very much for your interest and for being among us today. My name is Ana Escarrà from CJPE, the Confederation of European Probation, and I will be the moderator of this session today, together with John Stafford, former Secretary General of CJPE. This is the second of 3 webinars organized by the Criminal Justice Platform Europe. Yesterday we had the webinar from Europris, and tomorrow we'll have the webinar from EFRJ. The Criminal Justice Platform Europe is an umbrella network organization created by a partnership of 3 organizations, CJPE, Europris and EFRJ, with the aim of providing effective cooperation among the 3 areas of the criminal justice chain. The Criminal Justice Platform was launched in 2012, and since then we have organized many different activities. Every year since 2017, the Criminal Justice Platform organizes a summer course over 4 days in Barcelona at the Center for Legal Studies and Judicial Training. The Ministry of Justice in Catalonia supports the platform and provides meeting and administration resources at the Center for Legal Studies. Unfortunately, this year we had to cancel the summer course because of the coronavirus, but next year we will be back in Barcelona. So today's webinar is a taster for next year's summer course, where Professor Kieran McCartan and Dr. Lena Merdian will go through the main contents that will be further developed at next year's summer course. As we have more than 200 registered participants today on Zoom, all participants are muted and only the speakers and moderators will be seen on screen. This will allow the webinar to function effectively. Please keep it like this to avoid background noises. As also mentioned in the invitation email, this webinar is being recorded and will be put on the CJPE website, so you can check it when necessary, and it can also reach a wider audience. So the structure of this webinar will be a 15-minute presentation by the first speaker, followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. Then the same format for the second speaker, 15-minute presentation, followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. To ask a question, please use the chat function or the chat room. The question should be brief, ideally 1 sentence, and accompanied by your name. The moderators will put together all the questions and direct 2 or 3 to the speaker to answer. We are not using the Q&A or raise the hand function. Please use only the chat function. As you can imagine, it will be impossible to answer all the questions because of time constraints, but all questions will be very, very, very useful to give input to next year's summer course. So now it's time for John Stafford to introduce our 2 expert speakers. Thank you very much, and John, please, over to you.
Good afternoon. Professor Kieran McCartan, our first speaker, will speak on understanding and defining the challenge of sexual abuse. Kieran has an international reputation for his expertise in risk management, the prevention of sexual abuse, and the integration of people who've committed a sexual offence. He advises many government and professional bodies on this. Kieran's adjunct professor in criminology at Queensland University, a visiting research fellow at the University of Huddersfield, international chair of the Association for the Treatment of Sex Abusers. He's conference chair of NOTA and is a member of the current CJPE working group on sexual offenders. With Marianne Fugelstedt, who spoke yesterday, Kieran is one of the 3 experts drafting recommendations on the assessment, treatment and management of people suspected or convicted of a sexual offence for the Council of Europe. All of this shows that the rehabilitation and treatment of sex offenders is of very great importance to probation services internationally. Dr. Lena Merdian, our second speaker, will talk about online child sexual exploitation. Hannah is an associate professor and director of professional practice in the School of Psychology at the University of Lincoln in the UK. She completed her degrees at the University of Würzburg in Germany and Waikato, New Zealand. Hannah is co-lead of Online Protect, a research and consultation programme on online child protection, and is a founding member of the International Work Group for Best Practice in the management of online sex offending. Hannah's work is focused on enhancing professional practice, including psychological assessment and case formulation, with a specific focus on child protection issues. So two outstanding experts in their fields. So let us begin with Kieran. Over to you, Kieran.
Hello, let me just get my screen up and running and we're good to go. So thank you for that introduction, John, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm going to talk through some of the challenges and issues around understanding sexual abuse and what that means, and sort of give a flavour of some of the content and direction of the school next year. As John and Anna have said, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, and myself and Hannah will endeavour to answer them when the opportunity arises. So the first thing that I would start with is that what is sexual offending? And there's some challenges around this because sexual offending is a multidisciplinary, multi-professional issue. So there are some sexual encounters which are perfectly legal. There are some which are illegal because of the nature and the context of them. So for instance, rape is legal if there is consent. If there is no consent, it is rape, but it is the same behaviour and it is the same process. There is a difference between psychologically motivated offences like paedophilia, which is a sexual attraction to children below the age of 11. However, not all people who commit child sexual abuse are paedophilic. Some do it for power and control reasons. In addition to this, many countries don't have anti-paedophilic laws. They will have anti-child neglect laws or child sexual abuse laws. So what you end up seeing is there's a whole range of conversations that happens around terminology, motivations, definitions, and legal status, which then feed into treatment and rehabilitation. One of the key things that I would say about understanding the scope and the nature of sexual abuse is that it is wide and varied, and there is not a one-size-fits-all model that can explain everything from paraphilia to power and control rape to necrophilia. There is a full range of behaviours there. What you will also note is that these motivations change in the online and offline environments, as well as their engagement with material, which Hannah will talk more about later on. But what is the scale of the problem? Well, the challenge around understanding sexual abuse is prevalence studies. There has not been a lot of concrete prevalence studies done. There have been prevalence studies done, but not concrete ones. The problem being is that we know sexual abuse is underreported. People don't come forward to report what has happened to them. Therefore, it is difficult to get a true sense of the scale and scope of sexual abuse in the population at any given time. research studies show that it is believed that between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 people will have experienced sexual abuse at some point in their life. Now, this is on a continuum from contact sexual abuse to inappropriate touching, to grooming behavior, to online exploitation. But what that shows is that sexual abuse has the same impact on the population as, say, cancer does, which means that we talk about sexual offending in terms of individual perpetrators and individual victims, but actually we're dealing with an issue that, has sort of pandemic qualities that affects the entire population. As you'll see from this slide, this is a piece of work that was done by the Office of National Statistics in the UK in collaboration with the Ministry of Justice and the Home Office. And what it shows is that they estimate that there is between 430,000 and 517,000 sexual offences per year, but this only results in just over 5,500 convictions. So you can see the drop-off as it progresses through. So the reality of it is there is more sexual abuse in society than we know about, and it impacts more people than we are aware of. So what does research tell us about individuals who commit said abuse? And it's really difficult because, as I said before, there's not a one-size-fits-all model. There's as many different reasons why people commit sexual abuse as the people who commit sexual abuse. But what research tells us is that they boil down to something we refer to as risk factors. So what are the factors that increase the likelihood of sexual offending? And these aren't that different from a lot of the criminogenic risk factors that we see in the broader literature. So the research by West and Farrington and by people like Terry Moffitt and individuals like that. Risk factors may be coming from a criminogenic area, having criminogenic parents, being exposed to trauma, being exposed to adverse conditions early on, all of which can shape and inform the way that people act and interact as they move forward. Now, one of the challenges around this is a multitude of risk factors is not a multiplier. So when you have a number of risk factors, it doesn't mean you're more at risk of committing an offense. Say you've got 6 compared to someone who's got 1. That's not how it works. How it works is the way in which you process these risk factors and the way in which you respond to them. So you may have someone with less risk factors who is more criminogenic and more dangerous than someone who has more risk factors. And the reason for this is the counterbalance. The counterbalance to risk factors are protective factors. So strong community involvement, family support, feeling safe, feeling secure, levels of resilience. They can counterbalance risk factors. And this is something that we will go into more detail about in the summer course. So what are some of these risk factors and how do they play out? And it's important to understand that because, as we'll see in a minute, when we go on to talk about treatment and rehabilitation and reintegration, that's about building protective factors that can counter and go against the risk factors. So what is the current narrative on this? Well, sexual abuse has been talked about more and more socio-politically since the 1960s and the 1970s. A lot of this came out of the development of child protection, the women's rights movement, feminism, brought conversations about sexual abuse to the fore. We see it more. Most of you will not be able to go a day without picking up a newspaper or watching a TV news show or a documentary or having some form of social engagement around sexual abuse, with it being in the headlines. However, this does not necessarily mean that there's more of it. It means that we're talking about it more and we're exposed to the conversation a lot more than we have. Many countries now have historical sexual abuse investigations into practices in the past. Many organizations, whether it's the Catholic Church or whether it's the Scouts or whether it's homes and institutions, also have similar investigations. So there is a growing conversation around this and around accountability related to this. But what we find when we do research with the public is they have quite conflicting views of this. They have generally punitive views where there should be punishment entailed. They think that something should be done to help and work with these individuals, although at the same time, they don't necessarily believe that treatment and rehabilitation works in this field. And it's this juxtaposition that's important, and especially important from a probation point of view, because the role of the probation service, as with the prison service, is to punish, to hold accountable, but also to rehabilitate and to reintegrate, that assist and befriend approach that is so central to the successful desistance of people who have committed sexual offences. But sometimes in communities that can be challenging if communities don't believe that these people can be rehabilitated or can be changed or can move forward. So what we often see in terms of the community engagement by professionals is, I wouldn't necessarily say a hostile environment, but I would say a challenging environment where they work with risky and problematic individuals. They may not have the support that they need within community. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. What we aim to work towards is desistance. And desistance is the idea of why do people stop offending. For years, we have been obsessed with how do we get people to stop committing sexual offences, rather than thinking about actually those who had stopped offending, why do they stop offending and what are the reasons for it. Sexual offending has the lowest recidivism rate of any violent or antisocial crime. More often than not, people convicted of a sexual offence don't reoffend. But when they do reoffend, they can sometimes reoffend at a lesser degree. But all offending and reoffending is problematic and difficult and challenging. So a lot of research around rehabilitation and reintegration of men convicted of a sexual offence, I say men because it mostly is men, revolves around how they stop and the process and the journey that they go through to stop. A lot of this is based around something that you may have heard of before called the Good Lives model. And the Good Lives model is a strengths-based approach that thinks about what are the strengths that people hold and how can we play on those strengths to make sure their deficits don't damage the process that they are making in their rehabilitation. And this feeds into a lot of the stuff that we see across the criminal justice system about recovery capital and social capital, and how men convicted of a sexual offence can be worked with to reduce their reoffending and reconviction and to promote pro-social, engaged lifestyles. That can be a challenge because of the safeguarding and restrictions placed around them. Maybe they can't go back to their families. Maybe they can't go back to the job or the life they led before. So desistance is really about understanding what are the parameters of their risk management and how can they effectively be supported in doing this. But one of the challenges we see, and I notice I say challenges a lot, I've now become quite infinitely aware of that. One of the issues around this is the service user voice. And in probation and across the criminal justice system, we are now starting to question the service user and how we listen to them and how we engage with them. And do we really work with them? So it's this idea of, do we do to them or do we do with them? And you're starting to see this come through in conversations around trauma-informed care, how we engage with previous adverse experiences, and thinking about the clients that we work with and say to them, what happened to you rather than what is wrong with you or what damaged you. By understanding their journey and by understanding why they think they did what they did, they can have greater insights into the process and how that helps them rehabilitate and reintegrate. But to do this, and to do all of this work with men convicted of sexual offences, like anyone convicted of any offence, we have to value the professional. Professional knowledge is vastly important in this. I, as an academic, can write papers and say X, Y, and Z, but I am not sitting in a room with individuals that have committed these offences. So you understand them, you understand their processes, and how can we more effectively use professional knowledge and skills to build fit-for-purpose prevention strategies as well as rehabilitation strategies. And in the last few minutes, this is something I really want to focus on. The field of sexual abuse and working with men convicted of a sexual offence is really starting to move into a public health, holistic domain, where we now start to think about the prevention of first-time offending as well as the prevention of secondary and reoffending. So this is a diagram from an article that myself, Hannah, and some colleagues did a few years ago around why secondary prevention matters, why we should think about prevention rather than simply dwelling on reconviction. The problem with reconviction is it's after the fact, someone's in the system, it's reactive, there's a victim, there's a perpetrator, but it also individualizes the problem. It makes it about the individual victim and the individual perpetrator, which is important. But if we go back to that earlier slide, where between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 people have been impacted by sexual abuse at some point in their lives, it also means that sexual abuse is a societal issue, which we as a collective have to do something about. And taking a preventative approach makes it about health, makes it about education, makes it about upskilling people and making communities aware of what sexual abuse is and the damage that it can do, but also helping them factor into the rehabilitation and reintegration. People who commit sexual offences come from communities and they go back into communities. Therefore, it is a community issue, not just an individual issue. From a public health perspective, prevention straddles 4 main areas. Primary, which are your big public health messages, so like don't drink and drive, smoking kills, that everyone has access to, and we do quite a lot of those. Secondary prevention is working with populations who are at risk of committing a sexual offence. We don't do a lot of that, although over the past 5 to 10 years this has been growing and developing. There's pilot projects in different parts of Europe, including Dunkelfeld in Germany, Safer Lives and Lucy Faithful in the UK as well. Tertiary prevention is sex offender treatment programs or interventions that work to reduce risk. So that might be a CBT program, a psychodynamic program. That might be a combination with pharmaceuticals as well. And we do quite a lot of that. And in the course, we'll be talking about how treatment and rehabilitation reduce risk and how talking therapies as opposed to biological therapies may play a role in that. But what we do know about treatment and rehabilitation is it focuses on the individual and the motivations of the individual to engage in that. So how do we make people treatment ready? And going back to what Marianne and Nicholas were talking about yesterday, practitioner engagement in this process, and more importantly, client readiness plays a massive role in it. Quaternary prevention is something that we don't really do a lot of, but we're starting to. It's what helps reduce overcriminalization and aids in the reintegration. And one of the best examples of this is circles of support and accountability. that does a lot of work reintegrating and tuning the individual back into the community post-release and post-treatment. So some of the challenges around this is that each country has a different approach. There's not necessarily shared views on treatment advocacy and what that looks like. There's not the same funding in different parts of the globe as opposed to others. So we have done some work around there. So if you click on the, well, you can't click on it, but if you go to the website sexoffendertreatment.org, there is a special edition of the journal, the IAXO journal, where a number of countries talked about the processes and the treatment and rehabilitation that happens within their countries. Also, the Council of Europe is putting together a series of recommendations about the assessment, treatment and reintegration of individuals convicted of or suspected of a sexual offence to try and bring a sense of clarity and a steadiness to the debate around this. The challenge with this is sexual offending is a criminological issue, it's a psychological issue, but it's also a political issue, and sometimes it can be difficult to disconnect the political from the treatment and the rehabilitation. So just in closing, what I want to do is give you a bit of a sense. So I'll just leave this up here and you can look at it while I'm talking. The course will cover a number of different things, which we hope will bring some insights, some critical reflections about the state of the rehabilitation and reintegration of people convicted of a sexual offence, either within your country or within your organisation, with the hope that we can build fit-for-purpose risk management that allows successful desistance, prevents reoffending, and allows communities to be safeguarded so that not only are there no more victims from reoffending, but hopefully we can start the conversation about to have no more victims from first-time offending either. So I'm going to stop talking now, and I think we have John returning.
Hello, Kieran, excellent. Thank you very much for your super interesting presentation. It was very interesting. And now it's time for questions and answers. And I saw some questions coming in. So we have a first question from Michael O'Donnell. And the question is, what is the relationship between personality disorder and engagement in sexual offender treatment?
Okay, so the first thing that I would say is that personality disorder is a big barrier to any form of treatment and rehabilitation, not just sexual offence treatment. People with personality disorders, especially severe personality disorders, can be quite resistant and quite challenging to work with. So the reality is that in this instance, you have to do a lot of treatment readiness work with the individual, and you have to do a lot of advanced work with the individual because they may not even recognize that there's a problem or that they're in need of treatment or rehabilitation. And even if they do recognize there's something wrong, they might be quite resistant to the process. So I would say that the personality disorder is something that needs to be dealt with first before you can even get into the nuts and bolts of the treatment for the sexual offence.
Excellent, Kieran, thank you. Taking in consideration the time, we now have a bit more time for one more question. Another question came in from Kazia Grabka, and the question says, what do you think about using restorative justice in reducing reoffending in sexual offences?
I think that that's a brilliant point. I think that that's something that we should look at. The challenge of restorative justice in this field is, what does it actually mean? So if we're talking about traditional restorative justice, where we're thinking about victim and perpetrator sitting down opposite each other, that can be quite challenging. And experts, professionals, as well as academics, come from two schools of thought on this. They say that it theoretically might re-victimize the victim, and it might give the perpetrator an opportunity to relive their offences. Whereas the other side is actually it is quite good, it is quite healthy, there is no difference between this and other forms of restorative justice. This gives me an opportunity to highlight something that I've done some work around, which is Circles of Support and Accountability, where actually what you have is something that Lisa Ackerman coined as vicarious restorative justice. So restorative justice through learning, and Circles is a good example of this. So in a circle, you will have a core member who has been a perpetrator of sexual abuse or sexual harm, and you will have volunteers who volunteer to work with them. Volunteers can be victims of sexual abuse, and quite often a percentage of them are. And what is interesting is you have this vicarious restorative justice where the circle may have a victim of sexual abuse in it. So the core member gets to learn through their engagement with that volunteer about the impact of sexual abuse, and the volunteer gets to learn from that interaction about what some of the motivations or understandings of sexual offending are. They're not each other's victims and perpetrators, but they give a degree of insight. So what I would say is restorative justice can work, and there needs to be more definitive research done on it and outcome evaluations, but it needs to be treaded carefully with a lot of safeguards and protections built into it as well.
Thank you very much, Kieran. We are seeing many questions coming in. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time to answer them, but as I said at the very beginning, we will use them to give input to our summer course for next year. So thank you very much again, Kieran. And now to our second speaker, Dr. Lena Merdian. John has already introduced you. So please, Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kira. That was a really, really good introduction, and it set the context really nicely for my presentation, which is now much more focused on the practice of when you're working with somebody. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the video, which I think how I set it up means I will disappear, but I'm here, I'm in the background, and then I will be back at the end of that. I'm Dr. Lena Merdian from the University of Lincoln, and I'm co-director of Online Protect, a research and knowledge exchange program dedicated to the protection of children online. I'd like to start with some data. In 2018, in HOPE, the global network of hotlines removing child sexual exploitation material online, identified 999,000 videos or images confirmed as child sexual abuse. Between 2017 and 2018, so the most recent report, the number of these images and videos have gone up by 51%. Child sexual exploitation material, or CSEM, can take many forms. It can also include narratives or drawn images or pseudo-images. But depending on where you work, there will be differences in what material is classed as CSEM, how the material is legally defined, what assessment and risk assessment tools are used with this population, what type of intervention is offered, if any is offered, and at what stage this is offered in the criminal justice process. Child sexual exploitation material was initially often conceptualized as an old crime, new technology phenomenon, and people thought to apply the existing knowledge from the literature on individuals who had committed contact sex offences against children. But the emerging research showed that this population might have some unique characteristics that need to be fully understood. One of the key concern areas is risk. As you're working in a probation role, one of the main components of your job is to predict someone's risk of reoffending. But with this particular client group, we may also be interested, if not even more so be interested, in their risk of escalation. So what is the person's risk of committing a contact offence in the future? And what risk does this person present to their own children or to children in their environment? And of course, the last question is, if we identify any type of risk, can this risk be managed? And if so, by what means? So the first question is essentially about the relationship between CSEM offending and contact sex offending. One concept is that CSEM offending and contact sex offending present two distinct types of offending behavior and therefore require distinct approaches to assessment and treatment. And of course, on the other hand, you have the argument that there is a substantial overlap between the two. When you look at the data, especially the aggregated data, we can identify that about 20% of individuals who have committed a CSEM offence also admitted to some form of contact offending behavior in their past. This data varies between different studies. Some studies have reported up to half of their population, while others had significantly less than this. What this means, though, is when you look at the data together, is that there's a substantial amount of people where there seems to be no overlap between contact sex offending and CSEM offending behavior. And so the kind of first research stream was focused on trying to identify those risk factors that could predict such an escalation from CSEM behavior to contact sex offending behavior. The strongest evidence at this point comes from a meta-analysis by Kelly Webchesin and her colleagues that included data from over 2,000 individuals who had committed CSEM offences. You can see the four graphs displayed on the screen. So CEMOs are individuals who have committed CSEM offending behaviour. COs are individuals who have committed contact offending behaviour. And MOs are those individuals who have engaged in both types of offending behaviour, the mixed offenders, that's why they're called MOs. And with regards to risk, the group of the MOs is particularly interesting because they are the group of individuals who have committed both types of offending behavior. So they would have escalated from CSEM offending to contact sex offending or vice versa at some point. And this is why the factors that characterize this offending group are classed here as potential risk indicators. So when they looked at all this data, Webchesin and colleagues identified 4 factors that they would label as potential risk indicators of this population. So the first one is having access to children, so an opportunity to engage in offending behavior or, of course, seeking out such opportunities. Having a sexual interest in children, you can see on the graph here that the mixed offenders seem to be the highest group from the 3 offence types. Having high levels of antisociality, and this was expressed both in terms of measures that measure antisocialities, psychometrics or questionnaires, but also behaviors that would be classed as antisocial behaviors. And having few psychological barriers of acting on these traits of sexual interest and antisocial behavior. We now also have the first actuarial risk assessment tool that has been developed, the Child Pornography Offender Risk Tool, or CPORT, which was developed by Angela Eek and her team. And the validation study was published in 2018, so it's quite a young tool, but it's the first assessment tool that can be used in the risk assessment of CSEM offending behavior. However, risk assessment is only one element of the probation assessment, and so we wanted to get a better understanding as to why people engage in CSEM offending behavior. And that brought us to the concept of fantasy-driven versus contact-driven offending behavior. This is not a new term, so this is a term we adopted from the online solicitation literature from our colleagues Briggs et al. But we were the first ones who applied it to the CSEM literature as well. So what it means is that some individuals may engage in CSEM offending behavior as part of a broader motivation to sexually offend. So for example, CSEM could be used to groom a potential victim. So in line with the literature, we would refer to them as a contact-driven offender. However, we seem to have now this emerging group of individuals whose offending appears to be confined to the online environment, or caveat, used to be confined to the online environment, and they may engage in CSEM offending behavior, for example, to satisfy certain sexual fantasies that they may be having. So because there appears to be very little drive to move that into the offline world, we refer to them as fantasy-driven offenders. And in our work with professionals at the time, there appeared to be a sense that it's particularly these fantasy-driven individuals that provided a particular challenge for assessment and treatment planning in a probation context, because the existing knowledge from the contact literature couldn't be applied to them as easily as they might apply to somebody who engages in contact-driven offending behavior. So we focused our research program predominantly on this fantasy-driven offending behavior. So over 2 years, we interviewed individuals who were currently in treatment for the CSEM offending behavior, and we basically wanted to understand what led them to the offending behavior, so what led them to the place where they were currently at. And based on the narratives that we learned from these interviews, we identified common themes, and these themes may be ranging from growing up and the history to the engagement with the online environment or the sexual arousal that they were experiencing. And then we summarized this into this assessment tool that you can see on the screen, and we were hoping that we could develop an assessment tool that would help professionals like yourself to develop a thorough understanding of the offending behavior and how somebody ended up in the place where they are currently at, and then also to think systematically about the steps needed to prevent future offending behavior. One particular theme raised our interest, and it's a theme that we called permission-giving thinking. So how the individuals that we interviewed gave themselves permission to offend. So you may be familiar with the concept of implicit theories. It's a term that comes from cognitive psychology, and it refers to a set of underlying beliefs that people hold about the world, about themselves, about other people. And it's kind of like a set of glasses that people wear that kind of filters how we look at the world. These implicit theories are developed based on our learning history. So they could come from your childhood, it could come from certain key events like a trauma. All of these experiences shape the implicit theories that we hold. In the literature on offending behavior, previous researchers, most famously Ward and Keenan for the child context sex offending literature, have identified that these underlying beliefs, these implicit theories, seem to be shared amongst people who engage in similar types of offending behavior. So we were interested if we could identify such permission-giving thinking, such implicit theories that are specific to CSEM offending behavior. So my colleague Ross Bartels and I looked at the published literature at the time of any study that was published in terms of the permission-giving thinking or cognitive distortions of CSEM offending behavior. And based on this, we looked at themes, common themes that were emerging that would give us an indication of such an underlying belief that is expressed here. And based on this research, we were able to identify 5 specific implicit theories that seem to be specific to the offending behavior, and one much broader implicit theories. So the 5 specific CSEM-specific implicit theories are, the first one is unhappy world. So this is an understanding that the person is currently having in their real life, in quotation marks, having a very negative, a very stressful life experience, and that through their engagements with CSEM, they somehow seem to be able to escape this negativity. The second refers to the self as uncontrollable. So this refers to a theme that we identify in the literature, that people refer to themselves as being addicted or being unable to stop by themselves. So the self is perceived as something that can't be stopped, that can't be controlled in terms of the offending behavior. The third refers to children as sexual objects. So rather than identifying the children as people, as humans, and having empathy with this, there seems to be a disconnect between what is portrayed on the screen. So the children are perceived purely as a sexual object for their own satisfaction. The fourth refers to nature of harm. So this is a term that was used by Ward and Keenan when they identified the implicit theories for context sex offending behavior, and we found a specific variant for CSEM offending behavior as well. So this refers to an understanding that yes, CSEM is harmful, but that there are gradients of harm. So for example, if the material shows no violence, or if the material shows children of a certain age, then it's less harmful than some of the more severe material. It may also be a perception of oneself as not as bad as the person who's producing that material, for example. The final CSEM-specific implicit theory is a bit different in that it refers to the self as the collector. So this was a theme that we identified where people seem to have their main satisfaction or their main reinforcement from the material by collecting or accumulating a large collection, as opposed to the sexual element of it. This might still be a secondary factor, but like the main expressed motivation referred to the collecting element of the process. The final implicit theory refers to a much wider implicit theories about the reinforcing nature of the internet, so perception of the internet as a space that allows people to engage in whatever they want to engage in. So it's a very reinforcing environment. We have also conducted a study which has just been published, where we looked at these implicit theories in a cross-cultural context, so also looking at individuals in Spain, and we were able to validate the existence of these implicit theories. So knowing about these implicit theories can be very important for working with such an offender, because they allow you to understand why the behavior occurs, or how the behavior was justified to the person, and allows you to explore and challenge these underlying beliefs. Today was a very short overview of some of the work our colleagues and ourselves have conducted in the field, but this field is constantly changing due to new technology developing, new devices, new opportunities to offend being developed. So the research we're presenting today might be out of date tomorrow. So my takeaway message is to create an assessment environment that draws on many different elements and that integrates the existing empirical literature where possible.
Now, of course, is time for question and answers. And we've seen some questions coming in. The first question is, how can you research inform the work of practitioners working with the online offending population? Thank you.
So the question is about how we can do this kind of research. So the only way we can do this research is by working with professional services. So we've worked with probation services, or if we have community treatment centers here, so we always work in collaboration with, such a service. But that's something that I wanted to mention because it also kind of comes with Kieran's presentation as well. Of course, people who participate to volunteer, people who volunteer to do the research that we're doing will be a certain type of person. So they are people, who have committed an offence, but they're clearly very keen on engaging, with the academic world, and they're engaging kind of with this kind of research. And they're going to be very different to other people who may not have this drive to engage with research. So when you look at the research like ours, where we're based on focus group or interviews, so where the focus is a lot on people giving us information voluntarily as opposed to recorded crime data. It's of course putting a certain bias on the literature, so most of this literature is based on people who volunteer to participate, of course.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we have time for more questions, what is wonderful. A second question for you, Hannah. Where to from here? What are the main trends you are currently observing in your work with the online Protect?
So that's a really good question. So the one thing I've already focused on is that we probably don't see this differentiation, contact-driven and fantasy-driven, that we build our initial work on. So things are moving on to more like not such a separation between what is CSEM and what is maybe online grooming or solicitation offending behavior. But the main focus for us at the moment is actually young people. So you see more and more young people engaging with child sexual exploitation material in various forms, and people require certain interventions for working with this client group. And certainly in our research, it's been quite difficult actually to do this kind of research, because often in terms of getting consent, it's easier to work with adults. We really need to focus on researching and working with young people to inform the work that can be done here, to really inform, what's the best step of action to, both in terms of the criminal justice system as well as for the individual in terms of their reintegration.
Excellent. Excellent. One more time, Hannah. And we have still 3 more minutes for the last question. Thank you very much, all the participants, for sending us all of those questions. So I'm going to ask the last question. What feedback do you have from professionals, clients who use your tool in practice?
Yes, I hope you could actually see the tool, how it was meant to be. So it's an assessment tool that allows the clients and the practitioner to break down the offending pathway into the different elements of the offending behavior. So you kind of start with the past, what happened when people were growing up, what kind of attitudes did people develop to where they are now. And what people are saying is that often when they enter an assessment situation or treatment situations, their thoughts are really jumbled and there's so much going on, and that the tool kind of helps to make sense of their pathway, how they ended up where they ended up now. For the practitioners, the feedback has been that they find it very useful in exploring areas they may not have necessarily thought about beforehand, and that it helps them to think about what steps are needed, both in terms of preventing reoffending, but also in building on existing protective factors. So in kind of exploring the strengths and enhancing the strengths of the person.
Thank you very much, Hannah. This is very interesting. It's very much focused on a practice level, what it makes it even more useful. And I'm sure that we will have more time to go further it next year at the summer course that we will have in Barcelona. Thank you very much again, Hannah. And now it's over to John Stafford for some closing remarks.
Hello everybody, sorry about the blips and the sound quality. It's our first experience of doing a webinar and it's obvious that we're doing it live, so it'll be a learning experience, and hopefully in the recording we'll be able to rectify it for you so you can catch up. So in closing, we'd like to thank our two speakers on your behalf for their expertise and knowledge, and in giving us a memorable webinar. On behalf of the organisers, the Criminal Justice Platform, I would also like to thank you, the participants, for joining us for this session. When you leave the meeting, Zoom will open a survey page in your browsers. Giving us feedback is going to take you less than 5 minutes, and it's going to help us improve our activities. So please could you do that before Sunday the 12th of July. Finally, we hope to see some of you in July next year at the summer course, where we're going to examine this subject in far greater depth with our two experts. There's only going to be 25 places available, so my advice is to keep an eye regularly on the CEP website so that you can view the recording of today's event, that you can check out future events and information, and it'll enable you to book early in 2021 for Barcelona. Tomorrow is the third and final webinar in this series, and it's going to be led by the EFRJ. I would encourage you to join them, and our best wishes to them tomorrow. So thank you again. We'll see you in Barcelona in 2021. And please, everybody stay safe. Thank you.